In this edition of the Discover the Word podcast, we wrap up our 7-part study of the miraculous life of Elisha and discover that his life was so miraculous that even after he died, he seemed to perform another miracle. Seriously, an after-death miracle? Sound like anything else you've heard about in the Bible. Well, the conclusion of the miraculous life of Elisha on this Discover the Word podcast. Hi, and welcome to Discover the Word, Bible Engagement for Life from Our Daily Bread Ministries. Now, over the course of our last 6 episodes, Mart DeHaan has been leading Elisa Morgan and Bill Crowder on a journey through the miraculous life of Elisha, as it's recorded in the Old Testament books of 1st and 2nd Kings. This is one of our favorite series that we recorded a little over 10 years ago that we thought it was time we come back to. Now, this was before Daniel Ryan Day and Rasul Berry and Vivian Mabuni were added to the group, and so that's why they weren't at the table for this. And so as we wrap up this study of the miraculous life of Elisha, I think we will find some surprising and mysterious and miraculous elements in the way Elisha's life concludes, especially with some of the people who reappear from earlier in the story, people who he's impacted along the way. And there's a phrase from the New Testament that Mart will refer to that fits with the way that we've been seeing this story develop. He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. We'll see that in the event we look at to begin this episode. I think it's a good perspective for us to have as we go through life, because God is at work. We can trust Him that He is. And so the surprising return of a couple of characters who were involved in earlier parts of the story highlight this first section of the final conversation that Mart and Elisa and Bill have as they begin down the home stretch of this 7th and finishing part of our study of the miraculous life of Elisha.
How do you feel about people who begin a project or begin a lot of projects and never seem to be able to finish them?
They're starters and not finishers.
Yeah. I think back over my life, and I've been inclined a lot of times to start projects that I don't finish.
I'm like that too. In fact, I found myself, and the older I get, the more this is true. I will count the cost of finishing before I start. That sounds like the grasshopper and the ant. I don't mean it that way. It's just like, I will not be able to live with myself if I can't finish it. And so I have to really go, can I finish this before I take it on? And it's a sobering reality because I find myself not wanting to start as many things.
Oh, when am I going to grow up?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's some things like that. I mean, that's interesting. The number of projects that I just have to get it done. And other kind, if I can kind of get it looking good.
Part of mine is it's conditioned into me because for the last 30 years, Marlene's forced me to watch all these home improvement shows on TV. And you see all these makeover disaster programs where people start and they tear everything out and they spend 5 years living in a sink in the garage because they don't have any water in the house because I have these nightmares about that.
It's good. Yeah. And there's all kinds of things in life that we start. I mean, even raising children, you're never done, quote. You're still a parent, even though you have adult children.
No
the roles change and the input changes, but we're not through. We're not finished.
Maybe that has something to do with our Father in heaven, too, in working with us. He's engaged Himself graciously in a process that keeps going on and on. Thankfully, we see this in this amazing story of Elisha that we've been talking about for some time now. And actually, we're moving now into a series of last conversations, at least conversations that we're going to take with his story. And we're in 2 Kings chapter 8. We're going to bump into and read what amounts to a sequel. It's another piece to a story that you'll be familiar with it when we look at it. It's really the story of the woman from Shunem. Remember her story a little bit, the wealthy woman? Then it's going to touch on Gehazi, who was the
servant of Elisha.
Yeah, we're going to see a little bit more of him. In these next few paragraphs, we're going even to see another piece and part of a king who in our last conversations, he wanted Elisha's head. He just wanted to kill him. He was so furious because he blamed Elisha for this terrible famine that had taken the land. Anyway, 2 Kings chapter 8, and let's look at this and see if we can find evidence that, our Father in heaven is a God who starts everything And he's a God who continues.
Mm-hmm.
He continues to work in and through his people, whether they appreciate it or not.
Sure.
Elisa, why don't you start with verse 1? Bill, you two join in. Let's get through the story.
2 Kings verse 1 of chapter 8. Now Elisha had said to the woman whose son he had restored to life.
Now, what's interesting here is this happened 4 chapters earlier. Okay, in
It just picks it up
yeah,
here.
it's going to pick it up.
And how
again
long
now.
of a period of time?
Over a period of about 7 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this has been a while.
Yeah.
Okay, so now Elisha said to the woman whose son he had restored to life about 7 years ago, "Go away with your family and stay for a while wherever you can, because the Lord has decreed a famine in the land that will last 7 years." The woman proceeded to do as the man of God said. She and her family went away and stayed in the land of the Philistines 7 years.
Let's just stop for just a minute. Do you find this interesting at all?
Yeah, the fact that she settled among the Philistines is just
Yeah.
really interesting, because it sounds like David when he was running from Saul, and he took refuge in
Yeah.
Philistine territory as well.
It was fertile land, so apparently it's no surprise, but it is a surprise that she went among the Philistines. But what about the fact that there's more to her story than we heard 4 chapters ago?
You know, I like the way Bill said this at some point, that we read the black words on the page, but there's a lot of things going on in the white space that we
Yeah.
don't focus on. And so you're causing us to stop and pause and
Okay.
look at the rest of the story.
Because the last we heard, Elisha had been a guest in her house of herself and her husband. They were wealthy. They extended themselves graciously to him, and he wanted to know, what can I do to repay you? Well, she didn't really think she needed any help. She said, I've got my family. I need nothing. But then he noticed that she was childless. and
Which
he
is a
said,
big deal.
Yeah, big deal.
In Old Testament times especially.
He said, a year from now, you're going to have a son. And she was like, oh, please don't tease me. It was like he had awakened something in her, remember? And then she had a son. And then when the son was about 12 years old, you remember what happened?
Yeah, he died.
He died.
And she came to Elisha, and Elisha restored him to life.
Yeah.
There's a lot of famine and provision
Oh,
in this
yeah.
story. You know, personal famine,
Right.
family famine, famine in the
That's good.
land,
Right.
and then God's provision.
Exactly.
Death,
And
famine.
at that point, we see her own desires and needs have been awakened, but she was saying, God can provide for me. And she was learning to grow in dependence on the God of Elisha. Okay, let's pick it up here. So now if something has happened,
Okay.
that wasn't the full expression of Elisha's concern for her. He saw a famine coming. He told her where to go, and she did, to live among the Philistines. Bill, why don't you pick it up at
Okay.
that point?
Verse 3, after the famine ended, she returned from the land of the Philistines, and she went to see the king about getting back her house and land. As she came in, the king was talking with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God. The king had just said, "Tell me some stories about the great things Elisha has done." And Gehazi was telling the king about the time Elisha had brought a boy back to life. At that very moment, the mother of the boy walked in to make her appeal to the king about her house and land. "Look, my lord the king," Gehazi said, "here's the woman now, and this is her son, the very one Elisha brought back to life."
The king asked the woman about it, and she told him. And then he assigned an official to her case and said to him, "Give back everything that belonged to her, including all the income from her land from the day she left the country until now."
You know, we just ran through a lot of details, didn't we?
And it's a very spectacular story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reaches back to this woman, the woman of Shunem. Then it mentions Gehazi. Now, is it a surprise that he shows up here?
Well, the last time we saw him, he was struck with leprosy,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah. For doing what?
He had disobeyed Elisha. Naaman, the Syrian general, had been healed of leprosy
Right.
by Elisha, and he offered all these wagon loads of money and clothes and stuff, and Elisha said no. And then, without Elisha knowing it, Gehazi went to Naaman and said, "No, we'll take some of that after all."
Yeah.
And Elisha felt like it compromised their mission, you know. This is not what it's about.
Gehazi was struck with leprosy
With
himself
leprosy,
then.
yeah. But now leprosy shows up in the presence of the king.
Yeah, so you wonder, how could he be in the presence of the king if he's still a leper? Because that's
Yeah.
against the Mosaic
Yeah.
law.
Do you remember the story in the Old Testament of Miriam, Moses' sister? And she was struck with leprosy at one point. And then do you remember, was she a leper for life?
7 days.
Was that
Yeah.
all? Just
Yeah, it was
7
7
days?
days.
In her case, the leprosy came miraculously to get her attention. And then apparently God healed her because she was welcomed back into the camp. Just wonder here, because Gehazi's leprosy was in effect a correction. you wonder if maybe the Lord didn't heal him then later
It
on.
ran its course,
Yeah.
so to speak. Lepers were super involved in this whole story we've been looking at.
Yeah.
The lepers were the ones who went
Oh.
into the camp of the Arameans and found out that they had fled after
Right.
God's illusions towards them. So there's a lot of threads of this coming and going.
Right. What's really interesting to me is not only is he back in circulation again, but he's in the presence of the king. And here he is telling the king about Elisha.
Yeah.
The king is asking these questions.
That makes me wonder, and again, the scripture doesn't tell us, but it makes me wonder if perhaps, like Moses had declared the leprosy on Miriam and then declared it to go away, if maybe at some point the scriptures don't record it, but that Elisha took away, because we have Gehazi saying great things about Elisha.
That, I think, is the big thing. He's talking about the stories,
Back
the
in
miracles.
favor
Yeah,
again.
and the king says, now tell me, this is the same king who in our last account wanted to kill Elisha. And now he's asking, tell me about your master. Did he really heal people? Started talking about this woman whose son had raised from the dead, and all of a sudden,
Here she comes.
Here she comes. So you got all these coincidences, all these details that are flowing together. And if we just kind of step back from it all, what are we seeing? Aren't we seeing a God who has begun something in all of their life? The life of Elisha, the life of the woman from Shunem, Gehazi. We see the king, and all of them. And now there's this coincidence when it all seems to come together. And the king all of a sudden has a new heart. This is the woman that Elisha helped. And now the king is willing to help to restore the property that she had left behind when she went during those years of famine into the area of the Philistines. So it's like all of this grace just pouring out. And I think the question we ask as we read, what does it mean?
Yeah.
And we know that at very least it means that our God is a God who continues to work in the details of our life long after he's drawn us and called us to himself. The New Testament talks about that, doesn't it? That the God who has begun a good work is faithful to complete it until the day of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that is such a great and memorable phrase, isn't it? He who started the work will be faithful to complete it in you. What God starts, he finishes. And he is at work today in our world and in each of our lives. Well, we're wrapping up our study of the miraculous life of Elisha with Mart DeHaan and Elisa Morgan and Bill Crowder in this edition of the Discover the Word podcast. And so have you ever had to be the bearer of bad news? Now, that's not a pleasant job, is it? I think we'd all much rather be the optimistic bearer of good news. Well, even though he wasn't thrilled about it, Elisha had to be the bearer of bad news. And his news was really bad news for Israel. But is it possible that sometimes bad news is necessary to point us to good news? Let's listen.
I've noticed over the years that I stand in, I think, awe of individuals who have the ability to be bearers of bad news.
Our oldest son's in the military, and part of his job for a period of time was coordinating funerals for casualties from the Middle East. And part of that was assigning a chaplain who would go and inform the family.
That's what I'm thinking of, the chaplains. Even within law enforcement, there will be individuals who have to go to families.
Right, the doorbell rings
Yeah.
maybe at 2 a.m. and you pad to the door and there's a sheriff or a chaplain
Right.
there saying, we have some bad news. Are you the parent of kind
Right.
of thing? Or a surgeon who comes out
Yes.
from a long operation and reports your spouse fought so hard we did everything we could. There
Right.
was nothing more we could do. Wow.
Right, and there are shepherds, there are pastors who, and Billy, you know that well, what that takes to break the bad news oftentimes.
Yeah.
The reason I've been thinking about this is because we've been talking about Elisha, and it's interesting that his mentor, Elijah, was given some very difficult work to do. And at the end of his life, Elijah was just kind of broken, wasn't he? The bad news had sort of overwhelmed him. He was crushed emotionally.
Depressed.
it was like the Lord tried to talk him out of it or talk him through it. And remember, Elijah just wouldn't have anything of it.
Yeah, he just kept saying, take my life, take my life. And
I'm the only one left.
yeah, and God, in order to try to pull him out of that, he gave him a new assignment, gave him a purpose, a fresh purpose, which is really, really good.
But even then, a lot didn't happen. You know, he had run all the way from, how many miles was it from running from Jezreel to Sinai?
Well, it took 40 days to get there.
Yeah. And he got there, and the Lord shows up and said, what are you doing here? He started expressing what Bill, I'm the only one left.
Yeah.
I've tried to be faithful, and they want to kill me. You're right, Bill. Then the Lord gave him an assignment. There were 3 things. Do you remember one of them?
He was to anoint Elisha to be his replacement. That was one of them.
Right, and that was the third one.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the third one ends up being the first thing that he does. But the other 2, he was to anoint the king of Aram or Syria, which was very interesting.
Yeah, unusual.
Yeah, it's sort of like the neighbor across borders, the enemy nation to Israel. He was to appoint and anoint a new king there. And then he was also to install a new king over Israel.
A lot of leadership
Yeah.
challenges and succession plans.
Right. But Elijah, he only does one of the 3.
Yeah.
So Elisha comes along, and what we've seen in the story as the transition goes from Elijah to Elisha, we find all of a sudden that the God of Elijah, who was the God of the mountain, the God who brought fire down on this altar and showed himself to be the God of gods that the neighbor nations were supposed to see, that Israel itself was supposed to see. You know, that God continued in the life of Elisha, and he ends up doing like twice as many miracles as Elijah had done before him. And instead of just being a prophet pronouncing judgment on a nation that had become unfaithful to its God, Elisha becomes, he's like, first of all, a shepherd of shepherds, a pastor of pastors. He begins to teach and mentor a whole group of other young prophets. He becomes a counselor of kings, the king of Israel, the king of Aram. And he's oftentimes bringing bad news. Sometimes he's being encouraging. Sometimes he's bringing good news. Sometimes he's reminding a king that God can provide in ways that you never would have imagined, but God can provide. And then, as we've read the stories, we've seen God did provide. I want to take another step today and read as Elisha's story begins to wind down. I want to read the incident in 2 Kings chapter 8, where Elisha completes one of the assignments that was first given to Elijah, and that's to install a king in Aram, in Syria. Okay? So we're going to start reading an account that actually is going to take place in Syria, in Damascus. And we'll start at verse 7, and I want to go through 15. Maybe we'll stop as we go along the way. But Elisa, why don't you start reading? This is going to describe Elisha's interactions with some Syrian individuals.
Okay. 2 Kings 8, verse 7. Elisha went to Damascus, and Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, was ill.
Okay, that's the king of Syria.
Okay. When the king was told, the man of God has come all the way up here, he said to Hazael, "Take a gift with you and go to meet the man of God. Consult the Lord through him. Ask him, will I recover from this illness?"
Okay, now let's just stop here for a minute because we've got kind of an unusual name here.
Yeah.
Hazael, Hazael.
Is he his servant?
This is going to be a deputy to the king,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
And this king, Ben-Hadad, we've heard a lot about him so far. He's been an enemy of Israel, and at times he's wanted to kill him. But now he's referring to him as the man of God. He hears that Elisha's back in town in Damascus. The king is sick, so he wants to know what will Elisha tell him, okay? And he sends this deputy, Hazael, to meet Elisha. Bill, would you pick it up at that point?
Verse 9. So Hazael loaded down 40 camels with the finest products of Damascus as a gift for Elisha. He went to him and said, "Your servant Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, has sent me to ask, will I recover from this illness?"
Isn't that kind of interesting that he asks what he calls the king of Aram?
Your son?
Okay, your son, your translation says
Your
son.
servant.
Your servant, yeah. But it's a friendly term.
It sure is.
Yeah.
Your best friend.
After all that's happened, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a real love-hate relationship between Aram and Israel throughout the whole
there
story.
is,
It's
right.
really fascinating.
And between the kings and
Yeah,
Elisha,
that's
who
right.
becomes bearer of bad news, good news, yeah.
Verse 10, and Elisha replied, "Go and tell him, you will surely recover, but actually the Lord has shown me that he will surely die.
What just happened? Just read that again. No, at least see if it says it in your translation.
Elisha answered, "Go and say to him, you will certainly recover. But the Lord has revealed to me that he will, in fact, die."
Okay, I just stubbed my toe on this.
Yeah, he's saying both things out of each side of his mouth.
Yeah, and why he would say this is beyond me. If he's trying to deceive, then you would think he would just say, tell him he's going to recover.
Right.
And when you read the commentators on this passage, they're kind of all over the place too. They're trying to figure out what was actually happening in that conversation, what was intended. But it's not the biggest issue here, so let's let it go for right now.
All right.
Elisa, why don't you pick up at that point?
This is verse 11. He stared at him with a fixed gaze.
Now who did? Who's staring?
Elisha's staring at Hazael.
All right.
So Elisha stared at him with a fixed gaze until Hazael felt ashamed. Then the man of God began to weep. "Why is my Lord weeping?" asked Hazael. "Because I know the harm you will do to the Israelites," he answered. "You will set fire to their fortified places, kill their young men with the sword, dash their little children to the ground, and rip open their pregnant women." And Hazael said, "How could your servant, a mere dog, accomplish such a feat?" "The Lord has shown me that you will become king of Aram," answered Elisha. And then Hazael left Elisha and returned to his master. When Ben-Hadad asked, "What did Elisha say to you?" Hazael replied, "He told me that you would certainly recover." But the next day he took a thick cloth, soaked it in water, and spread it over the king's face so that he died. And then Hazael succeeded him as king.
Okay, so there we do get a picture, don't we, of Hazael's heart, his character.
Yeah.
Okay, now at this point, Elisha has also become very emotional.
He is. He's weeping over the whole thought of this.
Yeah. We're seeing Elisha's heart. We're seeing that he's weeping because he's seeing that the day of judgment has come, because a people that God has pled with over and over again, over the centuries, to remain faithful to him, have continued to worship the gods of the lands. And now he's allowing the people, ultimately for their own good, to see what they've done to themselves, to see what they've done to his name. And Elisha's broken over that. And he begins to weep because he realizes that this Hazael is going to be an instrument of God's corrective judgment. All of that brings us forward, doesn't it, to the New Testament.
Sure.
And we find Jesus himself weeping over that same people, over Jerusalem, and say, "Oh, so many times I've wished that I could draw you to myself, but you would not, you would not." And I think what's important as we read a difficult passage like this, in some ways the details are too awful even to think about, but to realize there's a heart behind this. There's a God who loves and a God who cares. And in the end, this eternal God will show himself to be the God of love, the God of compassion, the God of mercy that he's always been. But in the meantime, he's dealing very realistically with the sins of his people and using those sins to bring all of us to our senses.
Yeah, Elisha had to be a bearer of bad news, in a sense. But even in that bad news, eventually there would be good news, because God's heart is for his people, even in his judgment. That was Elisha's message, and that's the message I hope we take away from that part of our Discover the Word study of the miraculous life of Elisha. And so next, we're going to talk about how in some ways Elisha's mission was to bring down the system that was taking people away from God. And actually, he ends up having to finish some of the things that his predecessor and mentor, Elijah, did not do. Demolition, and how God intentionally destroys barriers between him and his people. That's our topic when this study continues in just a moment. Now, here at Our Daily Bread Ministries, we're committed to helping people around the world engage with the Bible for life. And one of the ways we do that is through our devotional booklet called Our Daily Bread. Now, recently, we discovered that our printing press, which has printed well over 1 billion, that's a billion with a B, of these devotionals, needs to be replaced. Mike King, our Vice President of Print Services and Supply Chain.
Hi, everybody, it's Mike. Our web press that we have out in the printing area now is over 50 years old. That is the cornerstone of how we communicate the gospel message of Jesus Christ around the world. And we need to keep that going.
And Mike also says that our press is a little unique in that most presses in the United States cut a traditional size of 8.5 by 11 inches. We cut a larger size, though. It's technically called a European cutoff, and it gives us a perfect layout for our devotionals. Therefore, when Mike and the rest of the Our Daily Bread Ministries staff started thinking about getting a new press, they assumed that they would only be able to find what we needed in Europe. A myriad of questions followed. How would we find it? How would we ship it overseas? How could we afford it? But then God provided. And Mike says that we got word there was one press available with our specific cutoff size in the United States. We were able to purchase it for a much lower price than we expected. And right now it's being stored before we officially install it, probably sometime in the next year. According to Mike, it was truly a needle in a haystack. God had provided, and we are so thankful. It's another of those faith and trust-building stories that keeps us fueling a worldwide Bible engagement movement. And if you'd like to help us continue printing Our Daily Bread devotionals and so much more, go to our discovertheword.org website and click the Donate button. That's up in the top right-hand corner of the page. Thanks. Now, one of the interesting things I've found in this series is seeing the way the individual stories in Elisha's life fit into and are connected to the bigger story that the Bible as a whole is telling. Mart's done a great job of leading us in that way, helping us read both forward and backward. All right, and so the harsh and uncomfortable, destructive part of the mission of Elisha, that's what the group's going to explore together next.
Are you intrigued at all by watching old buildings demolished?
Yes.
There's a real art to it.
There is.
Yes.
The way they set the charges to make the thing fall in on itself
Yeah.
instead of out on everything
Into its
else.
own footprint, just to
It's called
collapse from the inside.
implosion instead of
right,
explosion.
Exactly,
There
right.
you go.
I find myself intrigued with that. And sometimes, though, when I see other kinds of buildings taken down, buildings with a lot of memories. I remember a restaurant a few years ago that was demolished. And my wife and I had so many good memories sitting in a booth, in that restaurant. And it killed me to see it go down. I imagine people could feel that way about seeing an old childhood house.
Yes.
I started thinking about this because we're at a point now in the story, the unfolding story of the life of Elisha, and we're kind of winding down. And the last couple of conversations we've had have been very difficult. In fact, I came to a text in 2 Kings chapter 9. It is another one of these awful sections of judgment, but it has a place in the story. It's Elisha, we remember, was responsible in his life to complete some tasks that the Lord had given to his mentor, Elijah, that Elijah never did. In fact, let's go back and let's read that part.
The assignment to Elijah.
Yeah, it's 1 Kings chapter 19. We'll start with verse 15. But there's some very interesting things that the Lord said to Elijah that helped to explain these terrible things that began to happen toward the end of Elisha's life. Elisa, do you have that? Why don't we read?
Sure.
Start reading verse 15.
The Lord said to him, Elijah, "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel-Meholah, to succeed you as prophet."
Now, Bill, there's a whole lot of story behind all of these details, right?
Yeah, and if you look back a few verses, you find that Elijah has been threatened by Jezebel after the victory of Mount Carmel, and he's run to the Sinai Peninsula of all
After
places.
killing 400 of the prophets of Baal.
So he's worn out, he's exhausted, and he's discouraged, and he cries out for God to take his life because he's done. He doesn't have anything left, and there's nobody left. He doesn't see any hope for the future at all. And that's where he comes to when he says in verse 14, I'm the only one left, and they're trying to kill me.
Right. So the Lord gives him an assignment. In this assignment, he's to appoint 2 kings, one of Syria or Aram. What the Lord says next is troubling. Bill, read that once, verse 17.
Okay. And it shall come about The one who escapes from the sword of Hazael,
who will be appointed king over Aram,
Syria,
Syria,
Jehu shall put to death.
and Jehu will be appointed as king over Israel.
Yeah. And the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death.
And Elisha is his successor.
Wow.
Now, what's interesting is we've spent weeks now, over a period of time, talking about the life of Elisha. We know enough about Elijah and what he did. He killed 400 prophets of Baal.
Yep.
What would we expect that we would find in Elisha?
That he's a warrior, too.
Yeah, David was a warrior king, but now we find Elisha maybe is going to be a warrior prophet.
Yeah, he says anybody who escapes the sword of these other two kings, Elisha will take care of him.
Yeah.
What have we found?
Actually, what we found is he's not, in a sense, a comparison to Elijah. He's a contrast to Elijah, because even though not exclusively, there were some positive things, but a lot of Elijah's ministry tended to be destructive in nature.
Yeah.
Stopping the rain, creating a famine, fire destroying stuff.
Yeah,
falling
calling fire out of the skies, not just once, but
Right.
several times.
Yeah, and killing people with
Right.
that fire. So Elijah's ministry seems to be predominantly negative and
Yeah.
destructive. But Elisha's ministry has largely been compassionate, although there have been a couple of opportunities where it was different.
How do we explain the fact that actually Elisha is the replacement of Elijah when Elijah's kind of giving up and he's despondent and says, I've had enough? It's like the baton is passed on. Elisha is supposed to carry out it to completion, but it looks entirely different until we get to the end.
Yeah.
You know, we get to the end now, and in this section in 2 Kings chapter 9, it's the fall of the house of Ahab.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing here is that Jehu, who is being appointed as king, will slaughter the remainder of the house of Ahab. Now, why was the house of Ahab being judged?
Well, there's a big reason and a little reason. I mean, the big reason was Ahab, along with his wife Jezebel, had imported Baal worship into the country, and that had led the people of God away from the God of their fathers. The little reason had to do with Ahab coveting a vineyard that belonged to a neighbor of his, and Jezebel did some pretty rotten things in order to let her husband have it.
Right. So we're talking now about the bigger story. The bigger story is the story of the God of the universe.
Yeah.
Calls one people, not just for their own sake, but to show his love for them so that neighbor nations would see.
Because back to the beginning that we're referencing here, our context for Elijah, the assignment he didn't complete, the assignment that Elisha was to complete. We're back in 1 Kings 19. The next verse, after we've read what's going to be prophesied here, yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all those knees have not bowed down to Baal, and all whose mouths have not kissed him. So the ultimate goal of Elisha, is the preservation of the people of God.
Right. And people's lives will be preserved in the care as they entrust themselves to the God of gods rather than to gods of their own making. So what we really have to do then is step back and say, okay, how does this fit in to the bigger story of the Bible? I mean, where is it going? Because the baton went from Elijah to Elisha, but then it would continue to be handed down through history all the way until who took the baton?
Well, even in the days of Jesus, when he came, there were bloody kings who were warrior kings and who were ruling with might and power and ruthlessness. And Jesus comes in to present himself as a different kind of king.
A different kind of king, who in the process is revealing the very heart of the Father, of the God of the universe. And yet when we get to Jesus, we find some of the same kinds of contrasts that we see in Elisha, don't we?
There's a revolutionary kind of thinking in him. He goes into the temple and overturns the tables and has at it, rebuking people for really allowing a false worship, if you will, into the house of God.
When it comes to the
religious leaders,
the religious establishment, the religious leaders, he speaks fire to them.
Calls them a brood of vipers.
Right.
Couldn't you say that he reacts toward those who understand their need of him, and he reacts against those who would draw people away from him?
Right.
And you see his harshest rebuke, his harshest response to people who are bringing harm to the people who need him.
Right.
Directing really to false worship, really.
Right. Because We might say some of the same things about Jesus that we say about these terrible Old Testament passages. Why? Why all of the fire? Why all of the judgment? Why would somebody like Jesus, who is known for his mercy, for his love, why would some of the most severe statements of judgment in the whole Scriptures come out of his mouth? Then we need to ask the same question. Well, who is he speaking those words to?
Yeah.
To those who are leading people away from the one true God.
Yeah.
So as in the days of Elisha, the house of Ahab, this idolatrous king, was coming down, there's a sense in which in the days of Jesus, the house was coming down too. And what house was it?
Moses.
Moses. And what building? What literal
The
building?
temple.
The temple.
Yeah.
How long would it stand after Jesus?
Only till 70 A.D.
Right.
Yeah, like 40 years at the most. The temple came down. What had that temple been used for?
It intended to be used for the worship of the one true God, but it had become a place where it practiced a form of idolatry because it was worshiping the true God in the wrong way.
I think of Jesus saying, if you tear down this temple, I will raise it up again. He really was calling to a whole different kind of worship, that he himself was the resurrection and the life, and the relationship with God will come through the temple of Jesus.
A different kind of king over a different kind of house.
Finally, when we get to the end of the Bible, it all comes together.
Yeah.
But it doesn't come together until Jesus, the true king, the good king, the King of Kings, begins to explain what his Father is really like. And he does speak words of fire against anything that misrepresents that God and which puts obstacles in the way, barriers in the way, which uses the law to condemn rather than to counsel. And finally, we have a complete, overwhelming fulfillment of the spirit of the prophets, of Elijah and Elisha, but coming to fullness of meaning in a God who loves us and who cares for us, but who loves us enough to be willing to take down any house, the house of worship, the house of our own making, that keeps us from and keeps others from knowing the God who loves us.
This is the Discover the Word podcast, and we're closing in on the end of this series about the miraculous life of Elisha. Both Elijah and Elisha had a difficult, destructive message that they were called to deliver. But even with that, destruction was not the end goal of everything. It was the hard job of getting rid of the things that were pulling people away from God. And I think it's remarkable to see how God sometimes uses extreme measures to get our attention. But I think it's important to learn from these historic Bible stories and be reassured that God is working, and big picture, we can trust that He is working for our good and the good of those to come. Well, next we come to the 1st and 2nd Kings chapter 13 that says that Elisha died and was buried, the end of a miraculous life. But even in this event, there's a story to tell. And so first, Mart wants us to focus on the void that was left when Elisha, this man of God, passed away, and the angst not having him around created. Because whenever we lose someone who's been important to us, for a time we can struggle with knowing how we'll get by without them.
I think one of the hard things in life is to see a person lose someone who is not only dear to them, but somebody on whom they depended.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think about spouses.
Yeah.
I think about parents, of course. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, my mind goes to November 22nd, 1963. I was in the 7th grade when it was announced that President Kennedy had been assassinated. And I remember that long, bleak weekend. Thousands of people filing past the coffin, lying in state at the Capitol Rotunda, and then the processional of the coffin being carried on the wagon, and little John stepping up and saluting his father's casket. I mean, it was just
Jackie
awful.
in her veil. And,
Yeah.
you know, that's a great illustration of it, Bill, because it symbolizes a country's dependence on a presidency and its leadership. But then we all
Right.
saw ourselves and our dependency to a father, to a
Right.
spouse, to our family.
Our hopes and our dreams, and it's like our life is there in that person, and when that person is gone, it's like, what are we going to do? How are we going to move forward? As you indicated, Elisa, that can happen often in families, all kinds of different situations.
And it can happen in ministries.
Right.
People who've held a founding role or a visional role or simply an administrative role. It's
Right.
how do we keep going now without our leader?
Well, we've seen that also in the life of Elijah, in his passing. Do you remember what happened when Elijah was caught up in this whirlwind with these chariots and horses of fire?
Yeah, you hear this immediate lament from Elisha as he just cries out, my father, my father. First of all, there's this personal dependence on Elijah as he sees him as a spiritual father.
What did that represent, do you think, to Elisha at that point?
God's provision, I guess,
Yeah.
in some ways, and his calling. I mean, Elisha's been tapped to be the next prophet.
Yeah, he spent some time, hasn't he,
Right.
with Elijah, who has mentored him.
And now Elisha's caught up and gone, and when that happens, you're in charge.
Yeah.
But also, I think the role of Elijah, it wasn't just God's provision. I mean, he was seen as the national safety net. Because he represented God, he was kind of the protector of the land and the people. And with him gone, who's going to watch out for us?
Right.
It's a very unsettling time.
So Elisha cries that out.
Yeah.
What's interesting now is that we've come now to the point in Elisha's life where he's ready to pass on. And we're going to hear some of those same words
Yeah.
coming from a king, which is interesting. You know,
Yeah, because historically in Israel, the king was supposed to be the protector of the nation,
Right.
not the prophet.
Right. Let's take a look, because I think there's a fascinating event that happens right at the end of Elisha's life that I'd like us to think about together. We're in 2 Kings now. We're going to go to chapter 13, and we're going to start at verse 14. And let's just work through together what we find here, okay? We're going to come to the end, nearing the passing of Elisha from the scene. Elisa, would you begin with verse 14?
Now Elisha was suffering from the illness from which he died. Jehoash, king of Israel, went down to see him and wept over him. My father, he cried, the chariots and the horsemen of Israel.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That language comes up again.
Yeah, in some way, Jehoash has seen in Elisha the same thing that Elisha had seen in Elijah.
Yeah.
And he panics at the thought that that's going away.
Right. They've seen the God who is our protection, who is our defense. Yeah. So, Bill, pick up what happens next, because this gets really interesting.
Yeah, verse 15, Elisha told him, get a bow and some arrows.
Now, he's telling who now? He's telling
king Jehoash.
He's telling the king.
And the king did as he was told. Elisha told him, put your hand on the bow, and Elisha laid his own hands on the king's hands. Then he commanded, open that eastern window, and he opened it. Then he said, shoot. So he shot an arrow. Elisha proclaimed, this is the Lord's arrow, an arrow of victory over Aram, for you will completely conquer the Arameans at Aphek. Then he said, now pick up the other arrows and strike them against the ground. So the king picked them up and struck the ground 3 times.
Okay, let's stop right here. Elisa, what do you make of this?
Oh, this is cryptic. This is another kind of, feels like
Yeah.
a riddle to me.
Yeah.
It really feels bizarre.
It's a strange moment.
The first half of it isn't to me as strange as the second half. The striking the arrows on the ground, I don't get, but the firing of the arrow, at least my understanding is that was a way that you signaled the beginning of hostilities. This is how a war was begun, as one side would say, okay, we're coming after you, and they would fire an arrow to launch the war.
Okay, but what's this about Elisha, the prophet, wanting to put his hands
Well, as
on the
we've-
king's hands? And then he said, shoot. What do you make of that?
Well, just as we've been talking about that there was significance in Elisha being God's protection over people, was this a way in which God was joining the king in launching, maybe as you're saying, Bill, the attack?
Okay, so Bill, say that in your words.
Well, what I would say is, in a sense, Elisha's giving God's endorsement to this war that the king is going to launch with this arrow.
Yeah, Elisha, in one sense, must be representing the presence of God
Yeah.
and the strength of
That's
God,
right.
so that he wants the king to realize that in this war that we're going to talk about, you're not going to have to do it in your own strength.
Yeah.
And it begins with the king acknowledging Elisha is my father.
There.
So there is this relationship.
Right. I see the chariots and charioteers of Israel. So you're right. The king is seeing Elisha as being almost one with
But isn't it
the
interesting?
God.
I mean, one of the things that's come up as a continual theme throughout this life of Elisha is that this is in the northern kingdom, and the kings of the north are not people of faith. So here he's attributing some things to Elisha as the man of God, but he doesn't even have a relationship with God.
No, but he does recognize that Elisha and God
Do have something.
do have a relationship.
It's very odd.
Okay, let's go to the part that you say is difficult, okay? And it is difficult.
I think it's
I think it's
difficult.
intriguing. Elisa, pick it up at this point, would you? Start at verse 15.
Elisha said, "Get a bow and some arrows," and he did so. "Take the bow in your hands," he said to the king of Israel. When he had taken it, Elisha put his hands on the king's hands. "Open the east window," he said, and he opened it. "Shoot," Elisha said, and he shot. "The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram," Elisha declared. "You will completely destroy the Arameans at Aphek." And then he said, "Take the arrows," and the king took them. Elisha told him, "Strike the ground." He struck it 3 times and stopped.
So the picture here that is, the king doesn't have to do it in his own strength. He
Right.
does it in the strength of the God of Israel.
Yeah.
Okay, now, Bill, you read the next part.
But the man of God was angry with him. "You should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times, he exclaimed. "Then you would have beaten Aram until it was entirely destroyed. Now you will be victorious only 3 times. Then Elisha died and was buried."
Then Elisha died and was buried.
He did his part, yeah.
And when it says, then you would have beaten Aram, okay, that would be Syria,
Yeah.
until it was entirely destroyed. Now you only be victorious 3 times.
Yeah.
How do you feel when you read that? I mean, what is that?
You know, if all I have to work with is what's right here, I feel like he's being kind of harsh on the king, because how's the king supposed to know he was supposed to strike 37 times or whatever? He didn't tell him to strike it a lot of times. He just said strike the ground.
Well, maybe he said it and it's not recorded. But how is he
How do we
supposed
know?
to know that? And if I'm right, he said it, but it's not recorded, then how are we supposed to
Yeah.
know that, you know?
Good.
One thing that I wondered about is maybe there was some kind of ancient custom that we just aren't
Yeah.
given.
But
I
how are
don't
we
know.
to know that?
That's
I
right.
mean, we're the ones that...
We're left in the
You know,
dark.
the record is, the national record's been put in our hands now, and we're trying to figure it out. What about this? What if the fact that we don't have a clue what was in Elisha's mind, and neither could the king have, we think, what if that's the point? What if as Elisha is leaving the scene, as he's about ready to die, he wants the king to know that there's so much we don't know, that mortals like ourselves, there's so much we can't see, there's so much we can't know. And when we don't know, what could that be an incentive to do, a reason to do?
To lean, to depend, to have a relationship with the one who does
know.
It reveals our need
Yeah.
when we are forced to understand all
Right.
we don't know.
When we are told, when we tell one another or ask one another to do something for us and we're not clear or we don't give enough information, what's the natural response? What do we say? What does
Help.
the other person? Help me. What, I mean, what do you mean? Lisa, I'd like to, Bill, I'd like to do this for you, but I'm sorry, I just don't understand what you mean.
And how radical that immediately after that pronouncement, at least in our text here,
Right.
Elisha died and was buried. There's
Elisha
such
was-
a giant period
Right.
on that sentence.
Elisha died. He was buried. And we're left with a text that's a part of that national record at all, which says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he'll direct you forward. It doesn't mean he'll tell us everything we want to know, but he, in his presence and his provisions and his strength and his kindness and love, can make a way when we don't have a clue what to do.
I hope it was helpful for you to be at the table with the group for that part of our look at the miraculous life and death of Elisha, discussing how to trust God when we've suffered a loss and we don't know what to do. How will we live without that person or thing that we've lost? That's likely how many in Israel felt when Elisha passed from the scene. Well, one more segment to go and one more miraculous story. It seems like maybe in one more amazing twist, we're going to find that his miraculous life continued after his death. And after death miracle bring to mind anything else in the Bible? Well, the conclusion of the miraculous life of Elisha after we take a moment to look ahead to our next Discover the Word podcast. Next time on the Discover the Word podcast, we're going to spend some time with our Senior Director of Bible Engagement here at the ministry, J.R. Hudberg. and talk with him about 3 things that have been super helpful to him and have breathed new life into his Bible reading.
So my Bible reading has kind of gone through a transformation in the last few years. I went through seminary, learned the tools and all of those things for really reading the Bible well. What I started to discover was that my reading had kind of become a little bit flat. In the very kind of stereotypical fashion, I got lost in the Scripture as a textbook versus Scripture as a transformational communication from God. And so over the last few years, I have found 3 characteristics that are necessary for me to bring to the text to really allow the text to speak in richer, deeper, and even more transformative ways.
And so we're going to hear more of JR's story and have him roll out to us those 3 characteristics, 3 tools that we can bring to our Bible reading that he's found so helpful, and we're convinced that we will find it helpful too. It's an episode called What the Bible Can Teach Us About Reading It, with our guest J.R. Hudberg on the next Discover the Word podcast. All right, forerunners and finishers. Keep those 2 words in mind as we conclude this 7-episode series of conversations about the miraculous life of the Old Testament prophet Elisha. Forerunners and finishers. Throughout, we've been seeing amazing ways that Elisha's life is part of an even bigger story that the Bible is telling. And so as we look at the final event recorded about his miraculous life, we're going to see an amazing parallel to what the whole of Scripture is pointing to. And those 2 words are going to help you pull all of this together in a macro sort of way. Okay, so what were those 2 words again? Yeah, forerunners and finishers. Let's listen.
One of the realities of our generation is the internet, and it's getting the news by internet, and it's getting the gossip, the rumors, everything by
But
internet.
if it's on the internet, it has to be true, right? If it's not
It's become a real challenge, hasn't it?
The Wikipedia
Yeah.
reality of truth is what's being handed down, right?
Yeah, right. Now, there have always been rumors. I mean, it's kind of like we're not the first generation to have to sort through what is a rumor and what is fact. But it's kind of like our rumors can go around the world electronically like in a second,
Right.
a fraction of a
A
second.
Twitter feed.
Yeah.
So by rumors, are you thinking things like urban legends and things like that?
Yeah.
Well, rumors become urban legends, don't
Yeah.
they?
True,
What,
yeah.
And by an urban legend, what do you mean?
Well, like that there's alligators in the subways of New York and stuff like that. I mean, you know.
Or rats as big as cows.
Yeah.
Or as big as hogs anyway.
And sometimes there's simply misunderstandings that get passed on as truth. This is a silly one, but I remember for years people have credited me with founding MOPS International, Mothers of Preschoolers. I didn't. I was in high school when it started. I just was the first president. But it became an urban legend. And I joke about that. I said, no, that's not true. It's just not true. But people think it's true. So, I mean,
thought
it can
it was
be
true.
You see, there you go.
But there are some websites that are really helpful when it comes to needing to fact find, you know. Well, we've come to a point in the life of Elisha. We've come to the end after our many conversations together over time. And we come to a really amazing story that sounds, I think, to a lot of readers, sounds to me like an urban legend, or like it has those characteristics to it. But it happens after Elisha's death. I'm finding this in 2 Kings chapter 13, and I think we need to wade into it today. Bill, you and I have kicked it around for a time. I know you've got some ideas, and I'm anxious to hear you just tell us the difference between fact and fiction here.
I got them off the internet.
Okay, awesome. Okay.
Elisa, why don't you read 2 Kings chapter 13, and just read 20 and 21.
Elisha died and was buried. Now, Moabite raiders used to enter the country every spring. Once, while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders, and so they threw the man's body, the one they were burying, into Elisha's tomb. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet.
What else are we told about this man who jumped to his feet? Nothing,
Nothing.
right?
I wonder if maybe he wasn't dead. You know, you've heard stories of that. He was maybe just sleeping and they didn't know and they threw him in and he wakes up. I don't know what to make of it.
Well, read the first 2 sentences again.
Elisha died and was buried.
Okay, we've got that much.
Okay.
Okay, now next. Bill, you read the next.
Now the bands of the Moabites would invade the land in the spring of the year.
Okay, now what do those 2 sentences have to do with each other?
So there's some time between when Elisha died and when these Israelites were burying a man,
How do you know that?
because it talks about the spring of the year.
It's giving us a time marker. There's a hint that maybe there's a little gap in there between the verses because it talks about the body touching Elisha's bones. So that means enough time has transpired since Elisha's death that the body is decomposed to the point where there's only bones left.
Okay. All right. So we've got some time between them. But why would we have a statement of Elisha's death? He was buried. And why would it follow groups of raiders used to invade the land each spring? I mean,
Well, part of it, we've been talking about, Elisha was seen as the chariots and horsemen of Israel. He was the protector of the nation. And now you got these raiders coming in, and Elisha's not there to
he's
protect.
gone. Okay. Okay. I think that's the point.
Okay.
That's the point. Elisha, the servant of God, is dead. He's buried. And here come the neighbors.
Yeah. And it's not the Arameans this time. All throughout Elisha's story, it's been the Syrians. Now it's the Moabites.
Okay, so it's a different group of raiders
From a
this time.
different part
Right.
of the country.
Right. Now we know the rest of the story. We've been smiling about it.
Yeah.
What do we do with it? Is this an urban legend? I mean, it would be very difficult for those who honor the scriptures to think that this is just a rumor.
Yeah. Maybe one way to look at this is to tie it back to when the king comes to the dying Elisha and he cries out, our protection's gone because Elisha's dying. And this is a reminder that God can work even when the human instrument that he has worked through is no longer available. God is still powerful.
That makes sense to me.
Meaning the man who came back to life?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the evidence that
Evidence
God's
of
still
God's word.
working even though the prophet is dead.
Right.
Okay.
I think that's a huge lesson for all of us to realize that regardless of generations that have passed, regardless of the great men and women that we have depended on previously, our God is still with us, and he can still protect us. But now the question is, we believe in this kind of a miracle because it's a part of a book that from the beginning reveals a God for whom nothing is impossible. Okay. And we see this in the life of Moses. We see it happening in the history and in the lives of the patriarchs as well. The men and women of Israel whose lives reflect the provisions of God year after year, generation after generation, as one generation dies and is replaced by the other. So we can look back, but also as we look forward, we know that the story of Moses and Elijah and Elisha is going somewhere. And when we get to the New Testament, we have another series of events where those who have died come alive.
If I'm hearing you right, Mart, I think what you're telling us is that there are patterns that repeat themselves in the story of the Bible, but those patterns aren't just there for the sake of pattern. They're patterns to move us in a direction. Right?
And they're all pieces and parts as we move in the beginning and through the middle. But when we come to the end, when we come to the days of Jesus, all of those pieces and parts suddenly are like the pieces and parts of a puzzle. Now they're coming together.
Yeah.
Now they're fitting a big picture.
They tell a broader story.
Right.
They do move us ahead, but as we look at it now, they tell a more complete
Right.
story.
And once the big story is together, all of a sudden these patterns, these themes of Scripture begin to say, I see where this was going. We've been alluding to this a number of times. But Bill, I know you've thought this through carefully about the relationships that we see, for instance, Moses and Joshua and Elijah and Elisha, and then talk us through that a little bit.
Well, there are miracles in the Bible. We know that. But there's not a miracle in every verse. I mean, there's 3 seasons of miracles: the Exodus from Egypt, the years of Elijah and Elisha, and then the years of Jesus and the disciples. And in that, what I've seen anyway, is a pattern of a forerunner and a finisher. Moses is the forerunner who leads them out of Egypt, but Joshua finishes bringing them into the land. Elijah calls the people back to God, but Elisha is one who finishes the tasks that he did not complete. John is the forerunner, and he even says, I've come to prepare the way. He's the forerunner of Jesus, who is the ultimate author and finisher of our faith. So we see this pattern of a forerunner and a finisher in Moses and Joshua and Elijah and Elisha that seems to be pointing to a much greater finisher.
Right.
That they're just an anticipation of.
So when we come to Jesus, it's like all of these other hints and clues and patterns that have been born and moving forward all of a sudden come to completion. Now, John, who calls his nation, the same nation of Israel, to prepare for the coming of the Lord, when Jesus comes, it's Yahweh
Yeah.
in the flesh.
Right.
Yeah.
And when he calls to his nation to repent of their false ways and unhealthy and sinful thoughts,
Or their idolatry of
to
the
their
law.
idolatry, right? What they've been doing is worshiping the law and the temple and the sacrifice and the ritual, all of which was meant to point forward to the Savior. But now they have to repent of actually worshiping
Yeah.
the very thing that was meant to be prophetic in and of itself. It's really a matter of seeing that this story of verses and chapters has now moved far beyond anything that anybody ever could have imagined, to find a Jesus who's revealing not only the heart of his Father, but a life, an eternal life, an everlasting life that people like you and me actually have been called to experience. We look at the man who, the corpse thrown into the grave, he touches the bones and he stands up and lives. It sounds funny. It's going to be full of smiles and full of celebration when we one day realize we've been born not just to die, but in Christ, in the one true God, to live forever, to share the love, to share the joy, to share the life, the goodness of our God forever.
As we conclude our study of the life of Elisha, I think that's a really important insight to look back at, how at key times God sent forerunners and finishers. Important piece of the bigger story that the Bible is telling. Well, this is Discover the Word, Bible Engagement for Life from Our Daily Bread Ministries. And for this study, you were at the table with Mart DeHaan, Elisa Morgan, and Bill Crowder. And that's it. That's the end of this extended 7-episode study, one of our longest in quite a while. Thanks, Mart, for leading us through this look at the miraculous life of Elisha. And as we close the series, I think Elisa expresses something I think a lot of us would like to say to Mart after this.
I just want to thank you, Mart. You've done a lot of work on this. And Bill, I know you've been also thinking on this life of Elisha a lot. And what's happened as a result of these conversations, and we've had many of them, I've felt a paradigm pop. And we come to this when we read scripture. Sometimes we come to a whole new understanding of how this story fits together. I mean, honestly, the story of Elijah and Elisha has been interesting to me. But as you've led these conversations, I have seen the forerunner and the completers of the whole message of the gospel story differently than I had seen it before. And I hope our friends at the table have as well. Something I want to go back and listen to again and process through again, because there's a lot to bring forward and understanding and gain appreciation for the God that loves us enough to thread this story through generation after generation after generation.
Yeah, and I'd encourage you to revisit any parts of the study that you think you could use a refresher on, and also refer this study to a friend, The Miraculous Life of Elisha, one of my favorite series. Thanks again, Mart, for leading us in that. Discover the Word is a group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. Well, thanks for listening. I'm Brian Heading. Discover the Word is provided by Our